All right, let's get going. Tonight, I want to cover a little bit of stuff we didn't get to last week, and I want to start talking more about the faith of Gen Z, and pretty much from this point on, or at least after this class, we're going to really get into some more practical stuff. And I've been shifting things around a little bit. One thing that I want to do um, before this class is over, the series is over, is I want to bring on some teenagers, some of our youths, and kind of do some Q&A, um, and just talk and just spend some time getting to know each other. Little bit of an opportunity for you guys to ask questions, and learn from them and things like that. So I'm still working on what that will look like, but I think that would be a good thing to do. I'm going to start off with a very brief devotional, two passages to reflect on. What's up, Roland? These are, if we look at the history of God's people, we can really learn a lot about different generations and how they responded to God or didn't. And I think we can learn a lot from that. So I just want to read two passages that can show how quickly generations can change. This isn't anything new. Remember, a lot of this stuff is just generational things, but it is a new context. And so we have to learn how to adapt to that. But first verse is Joshua 24:31. So this would be at the end of Joshua's life. Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who survived Joshua, and had known all the deeds of the Lord which he had done for Israel. So one thing we can know about the people of Israel, if you read through the book of Joshua, the writer makes it very clear that these were people who chose to serve the Lord. Unlike, Moses's generation, who chose to kind of rebel or be afraid or be complainers, Joshua's generation, they followed the Lord. They had a few bumps, but not nearly as many as Moses's generation. But then we get to Judges chapter 2, which follows Joshua. So this is right after he dies. It says, and they buried him, Joshua, in the territory of his inheritance in Timnah Heres in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gash. All that generation also were gathered to their fathers, and there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord, nor yet the work which he had done for Israel. One generation later, we have a generation that by all accounts, didn't know the work of the Lord. And you have to ask the question, what happened? What happened from the time of Joshua's death and that transition to where this new generation grows up for them to turn out the way that they did? I mean, most of us probably know the book of Judges, and one of the theme verses is that, people did evil in the sight of the Lord. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. So you kind of ask the question, what happened? And, it's tempting to take a verse like this and be like, yes, that's happening right now. This new generation, they're godless. They're growing up in a pluralistic society, and they just don't know the Lord. It's tempting to say that, but I mean, my thought is, I want to ask what happened, because these kids, this generation, they were raised by another generation. They inherited the world of their parents and the teachings of their parents. And it's hard to think that an entire generation would rebel in the way that we see. There's got to be some kind of disconnect.
Kyle,
Yeah.
I think it's almost on the parents as well. They're oftentimes, I mean, whenever the children of Israel cross over a river and they'll build, they'll build this tower, a memorial to remember certain things. And they do that oftentimes in the Old Testament. The Passover, there are many different celebrations, I guess, that they have, and it's all to remember.
Yeah.
That's exactly what it was for, is so they could commemorate and remember the day that the Lord did this for them and the day that they did this. So it's almost as if the parents, I don't know if they stopped doing that for them to remember, but even today we have things that we do for our children, and we just got done with Easter, and it's not just a day to hide eggs and get candy, but it's a day, for Jesus and the resurrection, and that's what we teach our kids by doing certain things like that. So, like you said, for them to skip a whole generation and for them to not know the Lord, just from the readings, I think that's also the Lord's doing, because if they're not following him, he would allow his own children, to be taken into slavery and all kinds of bad things to happen just to show that he is the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
So I think to play into it.
Yeah, it's kind of like you reap what you sow kind of a thing. So I think it's something we need to realize is that there's error on both sides. Like the next generation needs to rise up and accept what they've been passed. But at the same time, I think the burden lies with us. The burden of that lies with us primarily. Just a reminder, I think it's interesting to see that what a lot of sociologists are looking at, especially Christian sociologists, and we'll talk more about that in a minute, what they're finding. This isn't unique to us. It's happened before. We've been through it. We can, overcome. It's not as bleak as maybe the numbers show. Okay, so last week, just really quick recap, we talked about some distinctive markers of Gen Z. I want to share them again really quickly. One, we talked about how they're digital natives. Hand a 4-year-old an iPad, they know it better than you do. This generation's entrepreneurial. They have big hopes and dreams about being their own business owners and doing good things for the world. They're very diverse and inclusive. This will be the last primarily white generation. 52% of Gen Z in America is white, and that number has been going down, and minority groups have been increasing. And at the same time, they're becoming more inclusive, probably in a lot of ways for that very reason. Number 4 is that they're less religious identification. We'll look at that in depth today. Number 5, their world is blurry. Lines between private and public, work and home, gender, family, a lot of even political things, a lot of their lines are blurry, not as rigid or defined maybe as we're used to. They're characterized as being overwhelmed. Mental health awareness has increased, and that's a good thing. But with that means more young people are saying, I'm depressed, I'm anxious, I'm suicidal. But we also talked about how they're far more likely than any other generation to go and seek out help. That's a good thing too. Number 7, they're shielded. We talked kind of about how our society, and especially parenting right now, is almost overreacting to just the dangers of the world. And in some ways, that's kind of shielding our young people. And then number 8 is they're progressive in as far as family planning, when to get married, when to get a job, political ideals. They, as a generation, are characteristically more progressive. And then number 9 was that they're individualistic and private, which might be kind of a surprise in such a very online public world. But what that really means is they're more private to older people and more public to their peers. They don't care much about, they care more about what companies do and not like the information that they steal from us, that kind of stuff. So that's kind of what we looked at last time. One of the homework questions I gave you was to think about, like, just from what we've talked about so far and what we've learned about Gen Z, is to think through what are some of the perceived challenges that you think this this next generation faces. And it could be pretty much wide open. I'm going to talk about some specific ones, but before I do that, I'd like to just hear from you guys. What are the perceived challenges that might be a little more unique to this generation that they are facing?
I'll go. I'll start us off. The new guy. I feel like we were just kind of talking muted. It's like we have 1 foot in this generation and 1 foot out, because we are a little bit younger. And I think just the amount of time that I spend online, I do like social media for a few things, and truth seeking is going to be very hard. Like finding truth, because there's 50 million truths out there, is going to be very hard, because they're not just taking mom and dad's voice anymore. They're not taking their church anymore, just their church. They're going to listen to thousands of voices online for truth. And that's like, totally overwhelming.
Yeah, that's a good one to point out. You know, I know that the idea of like relativism, moral relativism, has been, you know, a big topic for generations now, decades really. And in some ways this is a little different, because they have so many different sources from which they're drawing their information. And in some ways that makes them a little more well-rounded, which is great, but it also means church and the Bible and God have to fight against more sources. And our credibility is in question, just like a lot of people's credibility is in question. That's really good. What else? What are some other perceived challenges?
It's interesting. That was the very first one on my list.
Good, yeah.
I can see that. It's true for a lot of people, but it's got to be even, yeah. I see what you're saying.
Even the concept of fake news is kind of a novel phenomenon in some ways. You know, it seemed like even 15 years ago, it was quite easy just to discredit someone, and the general population would accept that. But nowadays, there's so many accusations, there's so many different ideas that, you know, it's almost overused. And so it's like, well, that other group says this is fake news, but that's the other group, you know. And so it's like there's a lot more stratification of ideas, I guess you could say. Jennifer, go ahead.
And the other thing that I think of is that the morals that we used to go by, that's kind of gone out the window, because it's kind of like they hold everybody on the same plane, you know, like you can have somebody that's, how do you say it? Become wealthy through showing their body, you know, and they have just as much credibility as somebody that's like a upstanding moral citizen, you know. And then same thing with the gender, you know. It's like it used to be kind of a lot more, I don't know that it was ever black and white, but it was like kids are so confused now because they get to choose, and the parents leave it up to them to decide instead of training them, you know. And I just think it's just got to be really hard, you know. How are you supposed to know when you're a little kid, you know?
Yeah.
So I just think it just is all so, like you said, nothing's clear anymore.
Yeah. And I think what I hope that one thing we gain out of this class is to learn to take that reality and allow it to transform into empathy instead of being reactive. Because what a lot of churches and Christian groups have done is they've become reactive and combative. And younger people don't respond well to that. And honestly, that's kind of a good thing. There's some there's some moral principles that Jennifer, as you said, kind of have gone by the wayside a little bit, at least if we look at like society wide. But what's interesting is that other ones are coming to the forefront, and this generation is leading the way in that. I think about things like sexual abuse or harassment, racial injustice. I mean, again, think about, has anyone ever seen the show Mad Men? I don't know if anyone's ever heard of that show. It's set in like the 50s, right? I think, and it's, I haven't watched very much of it. I didn't really care for it. But one thing that you see in that show, because it's set in like the 50s, is that like sexism is rampant. It's like, that's just a natural part of society. That stuff will not fly anymore. And that's a moral success in my mind. You know, the way that like Black people have been treated in the workforce and society, that stuff will not fly anymore. And again, to me, that's a moral success. Whereas other things like gender identity and sexuality and other things, you know, those things have maybe become more blurry and more distant from what you could say are Christian principles. Any other thoughts, challenges?
I would think, well, bullying has always been around, but online bullying seems to me to take it to a whole new level.
Yeah.
Where you can't just get away from it. And that, I think, is, to me, is just heartbreaking.
Yeah, that's good too. And I mean, even beyond that, just the extension of your lives online, you know, making everything more 24/7. You don't get a break. Yeah.
I was just going to go along the lines of kind of confusion in the lines of being a little blurry. Like in my psychology class right now, we're studying about gender identification and how it creates mental health problems because people they don't really realize like who they are. They're just learning who they are from what they see on the internet or like TV and even politics. And I actually see a lot of that in society. I think that's a pretty big issue.
Yeah, it's this weird paradox between having more freedom to be an individual and yet having so many options and choices that you don't know how to navigate that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Cool. Let me share.
Can I add something,
Oh,
Kyle?
yeah. Of course you can, Rebecca. You can say whatever you want.
One thing that I kind of thought of too was just how, you know, teens can communicate more when they're online, constant communication, but how does that like relate to face-to-face relationships and interacting with people like in the real world? Like, do they have those life skills that come with a face-to-face relationship versus online? Yeah,
that's a good point. It kind of reminds me of a picture I saw, and it was saying like, I think it had like a bunch of teenagers on their phones, and it's like kids these days always have their face in their phones, and then it shows a picture of like a New York subway from like 1920, or I don't know when the subway came out, but a long time ago, right? And everyone's sitting there reading their newspaper. And I was like, hey, It's like kind of the same thing. But yeah, I mean, again, just man, technology is such a huge factor in shaping this generation. This generation never grew up without the internet. And just that reality alone is mind blowing.
I want to add one more thing.
Go for it.
This is not to be political in any way, but when most of us were growing up, the thought of someone coming into a school and shooting it up just never occurred to us.
Mhm.
And now, how many people are afraid of that, even if they won't talk about it? I imagine there's a lot of fear for a lot of kids.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, just look at the rates of school shootings, and that alone should be enough to give any human a little more compassion towards our young people.
Yeah.
And their parents.
I
All
think
right.
Stan's got a question.
Oh, Stan, yeah.
Just a question for like Kyle, maybe Zach and Rebecca. I love the Coffee with Jesus, but they're not written like a cartoon. But I think maybe in our generation, that was sacrilegious to even do the thing. But yet I'm finding Coffee with Jesus one of the greatest outlets in conversion, maybe. Is that the kids use that today, Kyle?
It's kind of hard to hear you, Stan. You're talking about the Coffee with Jesus thing?
Yeah, you see, Amy posts those a lot.
Yeah.
Really great. Oh my goodness.
I think just openness to religious thought and dialogue. I mean, it's a double-edged sword, I think, because in one way it makes religious mockery, if you will, more acceptable, but at the same time, religious dialogue, and young people are far more open to that than older generations. And again, good and bad, I think. There's pros and cons to both sides. Okay, I want to work through just 9 challenges that, again, are not just specific to Gen Z, but in some respect maybe are a little more impactful to them. And I'm kind of gonna, if you want to stop, if anyone has a comment on any of these or a question, please just holler, because I'm gonna kind of blaze through them a little bit, because we're still in last week's class. So, but this is good, so I appreciate it. 9 challenges. The first is empowerment without wisdom. Teens are empowered with resources, but may lack the maturity to make wise decisions. Again, that's not new. That's just being young, but it's amplified by things like technology and our social context. Number 2, stimulation without ownership. Adults have overloaded teens with activities and neglected to allow for ownership and self-direction. I would kind of argue with that last one. I think actually parents are a little more or maybe too self-directing. But, and this isn't just for parents, this is just all adults, whether they're company, like representing a company, or, an influencer or anything like that. Too many choices, not enough ownership. Number 3 is privileges without responsibility. Teens have been given a sense of entitlement without earning them through responsible actions. And again, this is kind of that age-old, our generation worked for this and you guys just reap the benefits, right? Next one, number 4, involvement without boundaries. Too many options to be involved leads to anxiety and inability to choose or to learn how to set healthy boundaries. I think that's a big one. Like, you look at adults today who work themselves to death and they don't know how to set healthy boundaries for themselves. How are they going to learn to teach healthy boundaries to their kids? And a lot of times the way they do that is either through some kind of structure or rules. And both of those things, often the teens don't have any control over that. The next one, number 5, is individualism without perspective. I think this is what Heather brought up in our first session. Teens desire individuality, and without the tools to adjust to a changing world, they are less able to see the bigger picture. So again, it's kind of a paradox that this generation is more global than any other generation, I would say, and yet they often kind of lack that just perspective that comes with experience. But I would say again, I think we would be surprised at how intelligent our young people are and how savvy they are to what's going on in the world. It kind of reminds me almost of like how the Vietnam War was like a catalyst for social activism. Some of you might remember that, not to put an age on anyone, but that kind of idea, right? Number 6 is accessibility without accountability. This one's huge, I think. Teens have way more access to everything, and fewer filters or consequences can lead to trouble. I was just reading today about like pornography or like sexually explicit websites. There was one in particular that had in 1 year like over 13 billion visitors. Visits, yeah. 13 billion in 1 year. And the exposure to that, again, it's not, the times where you had to sneak out and, sneak a magazine from your dad's closet or something are long gone. Now it's right here all the time. Fluidity without integrity is the next one, 7. As nothing stays the same, moral relativism thrives, and teens struggle to find a moral center. We already kind of talked about that. Number 8, opportunity without resilience. I think this one is very specific to this generation. So many opportunities. Facing and overcoming struggles is easily avoided. If something's too hard, just choose something else. It's easy just to kind of quit, or there's less, in some ways, opportunities to face and overcome adversity. And that is diminishing our young people's ability to foster resilience. The last one is consumption without reflection. This is one I would actually kind of push back against too. But there's people are saying, sociologists are saying, consuming things, which is like purchases, media, ideas, anything they can consume, without critical reflection enables them to be shallow and selfish. I would actually push back on this one because from my experience, young people are far more conscious of what they consume. I think about things like Save the Turtles, conscious of how much plastic we use and where it goes, conscious of how people are treated, those kind of things. But, any young person is going to be more self-centered. I mean, that's a very natural thing.
I kind of feel like that describes my generation, honestly.
Well, it's interesting how there's certain things that, they'll skip generations.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some ways in which you'll be like, man, when I was young, that sounded just like my generation, and, or we were the opposite. It's interesting to see how there are some parallels. The circle comes all the way back around eventually. What's interesting, and I'll talk about this a little bit, when we get to faith, at least the numbers show a little bit of a pendulum swing. So like millennials, my generation, I mean, in the past 10 years, we've seen like so many books written about how millennials are leaving the church and millennials are walking away. I think millennials have reacted much stronger to like against faith and religion than this generation has, even though they're less likely to identify with some kind of Christian or religious identity. They don't react, Gen Z does not react as strongly. It's interesting. So we talked about some of these challenges, and eventually I want us to get to where does the church come in and how do we address some of these challenges. But I'm going to let it sit for a little bit because I want to talk about faith of Gen Z. So to kick that off, I want to maybe ask a question, just some comparison stuff. So if we were to think back, just what is maybe the biggest battle in the past 50 years that the church has faced with society or something? There's probably several different answers we could give, but one that really came to mind was the battle between science and faith. Something that, you know, has always stood out to me is that Time magazine cover from 1966 that said, "Is God dead?" You know, and how the past 50 or 70 years, there's kind of been this battle, and probably really even longer than that, between like between faith and science. You know, they're treated as like opposing forces, or at least they have been. And I think that thinking has kind of gone by the wayside. I don't think that is our battle anymore. A lot of people have started to realize that faith and science really like are complementary, and that's a good thing. You know, over time the waters have settled. But what would you guys say is the next or the current battle between church and culture, if you will? Faith versus blank. How would you fill in that blank? Stan.
Women's issue.
Women's issues. What do you mean by that?
Well, looking at the, Don and I are kind of obsessive compulsive on this here. It's like watching, I don't know if kids see in workplaces, all of these military, you see women stepping in the roles that used to be,
Okay.
or women are in the infantry, they're chairmen of boards of corporation, and they're starting up their own businesses.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's funny. I don't know any other way to say this other than to say for Generation Z, that battle is long gone. The church is still wrestling with it, to be real. But generation, and that's where potentially the church could be a place that's difficult for young people. But young people have pushed that aside a long time. You know, they would have little patience for, you know, women not being, or, you know, included, I guess, if you will. Not to open a can of worms, but it is a battle that church, I mean, obviously churches have been talking about that for 40 years. But for young people, it's it's not something it's not on their radar anymore. Other thoughts? It doesn't have to be one right answer necessarily.
Are you asking about specifically for them what we would perceive as battles, or I'm a little
Not
confused.
necessarily, but I think what I want us to think about is what roadblocks might be in place for unchurched people right now, and especially young unchurched people.
Well, why is your religion any better than anybody else's?
Okay, yeah, that's a good one. The idea, and we talked about this a little bit, the idea of like converting someone, how that is almost offensive, especially in a pluralistic society where it's like, hey, you have your faith, I have mine, great. All roads lead to the same mountaintop, right? And learning to navigate that in a new way is difficult for the church. And we have to be conscientious of how young people perceive that. Zach, you were going to say something.
I've seen a lot of chatter about, I was just saying, I think motives maybe is a word, or like intention of the church. Like it's like double, not double standards even, but just like the idea that the intention of the church is to control me, or to stop me from doing something, or to set me in my place, or to, gatekeep people, like gatekeep society, is kind of like the global perspective. It's not as much individualistic anymore. It's more like these are naysayers in a world that deserves to be told yes. And I'm not trying to say this, that's what I'm seeing. It's not that I'm trying to say that's wrong. I think I see a lot of talk about that.
Yeah.
Oh,
Words that come to mind are like integrity or tolerance. When tolerance is a core value of society, the church is going to come into conflict with that, right? I mean, because we want to be tolerant, but we also have certain standards that we're trying to live up to, that we believe Jesus has called us to live up to. And when society says, oh, the standards are oppressive because you're not being tolerant, that's an issue. So how do we teach young people that? Yeah, Jen.
Well, it's difficult because so many of the things that are being normalized that don't agree with the Bible, so
Yeah.
then it's like that's just part of it,
Yeah, and again, our what we're trying to figure out is how do we be responsive to that and not reactive. I saw maybe a couple hands. Elena, were you gonna? Zach muted you though, so.
I was just gonna go off kind of that same topic of what the church is doing. And I think we've had a lot of discussions about millennials because we are of that generation. And so many of the people we even went to Harding with have just kind of renounced their faith in the name of the church. So like the congregation, or there was the Church of Christ, or just somehow their upbringing pushed them away from the church. But I think it's like there needs to be a new conversation of not what does your church speak for, but like really truly bringing it back to what is Jesus saying? How is the Bible teaching your, like, and we always talk about like when our friends are like, oh, well, I'm so mad at the church or whatever for X, Y, and Z. We're like, why are you allowing a group of people to have jaded your faith when that wasn't Jesus? Jesus didn't push you away. Maybe a group of people did who are imperfect because the body of Christ is made up of imperfect people. But bringing people back to the idea that the congregation is not some corporation that the head is man. The head has always been Christ. And sometimes I think we lose sight of that. And so many churches are trying to like rally around this idea of like what their church is going to offer you. But I think that you things get convoluted when you are kind of preaching your message in the name of a church as opposed to Christ, what he did, him as a person. And I love that you mentioned, I don't remember who it was, mentioned Easter and teaching our children about Easter, because I loved doing that with Roland this year and teaching him solely, like the whole story, and teaching him about Jesus as opposed to like only learning from church or only learning what the church teaches. So it really has to start in the home. The parents have to teach God, and then the church can kind of reinforce all of that. And that's the way it's supposed to be. And I think we just got away from that.
Yeah. One thing that I think I've seen, even with millennials, I think we are reaping what we have sown as a church, where we entered into and this is like cyclical in church history, right? But we went through this period where we had to circle the wagons and talk about how are we, our congregation or our Christian movement, how are we distinct from the church down the street? Because they've got it wrong and we've got it right. And we went through decades of that. And I think the byproduct of that is a lot what Elena's talking about, this idea that we taught people doctrine, not the gospel. And there's a huge difference, And now we're seeing a couple generations of that, parents not knowing how to teach their kid, and then the next generation having no idea what to do after that. When we focus on doctrine, which I don't want to use as a dirty word necessarily, because it's not, the word itself is good, but that idea of, this is how we do it. It has its consequences, I guess you could say. Anything else? I don't know if there are any other hands or comments.
Zach has a great wife there.
Oh yeah.
Doesn't he, Kyle?
Yeah.
One thing I want to mention, and I'm not sure if it's kind of been brought out, but one thing that I really struggle with is there are things that the Bible teach that I know that are wrong. But I know we're supposed to treat people in a loving manner. And I feel more today than we ever have been that we kind of, as the church, we are supposed to love people, but we're also supposed to teach the difference between right and wrong. And that's one thing that I know kids struggle a lot with, because they're like, well, we're the church, aren't we supposed to love these people? So loving means accepting. And I think there's a fine line between accepting something and, almost a hard love. And that's a struggle to me, just because it's so prevalent that we're supposed to accept, we're the church, we're supposed to love. Oh, but now, they're homosexuals and we're supposed to love them, but how do you do that and also teach God's love and what how God feels about it and how he described it in the Bible?
Yeah,
I think that's a very difficult thing to do, and it's more prevalent now than ever, with many, many different topics.
Yeah. And I think one thing I do want to say is, like, I never want to come across as if I'm saying like the church just needs to like relax, don't teach any more doctrine, just be lovey-dovey. We do have a fight on our hands, and there are things that we need to stand up for. But I think how we've done it sometimes, the methodology we've chosen hasn't always been very good. One thing that I was going to talk about is just like different approaches that we've kind of tried as a church in this battle between church and the world, on ever going battle. Fundamentalism, this idea that we should cloister ourselves and strictly define ourselves and reject anything outside of that. I mean, I see that there is some of that. Of course, there's ways in which scripture makes very clear lines, but that mentality doesn't always work, and I think we've extended it far beyond what we needed to, just like the Pharisees did, right? Religious combativism, whatever, however you say that. You know, this idea that, okay, not only are we going to cloister ourselves, but we're going to go on the offensive. You know, we're going to shove our ideas down people's throats, basically. We're going to prove that these atheists are idiots, you know. That doesn't play very well either with this generation. And then another failing, I think, is what I just call Christian whateverism. This idea that we're just going to water things down, just talk about Jesus, and everyone's going to look like little Christian Ken and Barbie dolls, and it's all cookie cutter, and, you know, there's no depth, there's no substance. You know, churches have tried that too, and they can get really big. It's really easy to fill a building with that gospel, but there's not much gospel to it. So,
I think Janine had a question, Kyle.
Janine, go for it.
I wanted to make an observation. When earlier talked about the fight the church had with science, for instance, and that's kind of calmed down. I don't, having read some stuff about some science regarding gender identity, there's just a lot that we don't know, and this is an area in which we're going to have to be acquainted somewhat with what the science is saying, I think, and I don't know how to face that, except we just need to face it with love. And
yeah, I agree. And I think this again is where either, you know, fundamentalism or combatism, I'm not going to get that one right, but you know what I'm saying. You know, that's where we've made up our minds about things, and anything in opposition is wrong. And I think we need to learn to better balance the grit or the backbone of holding to principles that we know are timeless, and the humility of recognizing that humans have been screwing this thing up for a long time, and there's still stuff we can learn, you know. I mean, thank the Lord that, at least for the most part, Christians aren't killing each other like they did in the 1500s. You know, we used to literally kill other groups of Christians in our own countries because they had different doctrines. Well, we've learned and grown from that. You know, we used to enslave Black people, and we would use scripture to justify those things. No one would do that today. That's insane. You know, there's lots of different things that we are still learning. Even, I mean, scripture itself shows that there are things that the Israelites had to learn, and God revealed things to them more and more over time. So I think really where the rubber hits the road is we get in trouble when we are reactive instead of responsive, or when we react instead of, like, take a deep breath, pause, listen, learn, and then say something intelligent, you know. And the biggest thing is that our young people are watching, and they're smarter than we think. Nilda.
Sometimes I feel like the church has forgotten that we can't expect people to obey the teachings of the Bible when they don't even believe, and to criticize, and it's coming at it backwards, you know, to come to people and say, well, you can't do that because God says it's wrong. Well, if they don't believe in God or they don't care, what, you have no leg to stand on.
Yeah.
First, they have to fall in love with Jesus before they're going to care about what he says or what God says about anything. And so to be condemning people for living in sinful ways when they're not even trying to follow Christ is missing the boat, I feel like, or it's getting the cart ahead of the horse. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. And then when we respond with, attacks against our culture that's living in sin, our young people look at us and say, hey, hold on a second. Last Sunday, you talked about not judging other people, and by the standards by which you judge others, you will be judged. Like, hold on a second. This isn't like what's going on, Zach, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I also think that as you had talked about a little bit earlier, like America is getting a lot more diverse. Kids are growing up with a different group of friends than we grew up with, or other people, older folks grew up with, where it looked a certain way. And now people have personal examples of some of their best friends that are gay, don't know what their gender is, from other countries. And those are personal examples that when it comes across, when we say, or, when you come across and say, oh, this is a problem, or this is dumb, or whatever, it kind of goes personally back to their friend, or their world. It's like there's a personal connection that, for prime example, like when I was in college, I was a very good friend with a guy for a long time, and post college, he came out as gay, and I never had that close of a person in an area that like ever. I've never had a very good homosexual friend before. And something changes when you have a very personal investment in a group of people, or that person, or something. So I think that's also just different as the world diversifies, and somebody said, more things are normalizing that, 50 years ago wasn't good or wasn't normal. It's just a different world, That's also, things are more personal now.
And I feel like Gen Z has something, like they have an advantage over all of us, because I feel like they are more capable of loving these people with condemnable sins, and sins we would just basically threw to the wayside. It's not like, oh, love the drunk, hate the sin, but it's like, love the person who's gay, hate the sin. But like, yeah, you're right, it is harder, but it's almost like this new generation, it's like easier for them to love these people. And I wonder if that's going to be a huge blessing for the church, because they're capable of doing something that how many generations before them couldn't do. And maybe through that love, there's going to be a revolution of something I don't even know what it would be, but something completely different. And I know this whole idea of love can get very messy without that doctrine, but I do think that if there are, finding that love, that helping them to find that love for Jesus again, and then having a friend, being able to have those normal conversations and then loving conversations kind of go hand in hand. And I don't know, I that gives me peace when I think about, sometimes those generational things that are like, whoa, like they're accepting way too much or whatever, this and that, but they're also capable of, I think, so much more than we are.
Yeah. Their capacity to be compassionate is very cool. And one thing, like, I think to kind of drive this home, I don't want to get myself in trouble here, but I think what this generation gets that most older generations don't, I do think I would throw millennials into this category too, because they've just been very burnt, I think, by religion or the church, but they understand this idea. They care more about a person knowing Jesus than the fact that they're gay, if that makes sense. They know that they will have no success trying to convince them that being gay is wrong, but they could probably have success showing them that Jesus is their Lord. And which one is more important, I guess, is just the question I'll leave us with. I agree with Elena. I am excited to see what this generation can do with their compassion. And I think it, honestly, remember back to our first session when we talked about anxiety, that idea makes us anxious. How can these young people, like, what's going to happen if they just do the love thing, but they don't have the doctrine and they don't have the substance and they don't know, they don't know our 4-part a cappella songs. What's going to happen? We're anxious about that. We're scared. But what's really behind that fear is a desire for people to know Christ. So let's act out of that desire instead of out of our fear. Okay. This has been good stuff. Let me throw some statistics at you. Because we've gotten into the faith stuff pretty well. But I think, honestly, what this shows is that our own ghosts are still haunting us. And we have to figure that out while also trying to help this next generation grow to become leaders. And so we've got a lot on our plates. Okay. Generation Z, who identify as atheists, has doubled from the previous generation. I think that statistic is misleading. So it's gone from 5 to 7% in the last 3 generations to 13% in Gen Z. I think that statistic is misleading because I think there's a difference between being openly an atheist and being an I don't really care-ist. And I think my guess is that it leans more towards the I don't really care about religion. Sure, yeah, I'm an atheist. Because they know that means they're not a Christian, and so that's just like the opposite. So that freaks a lot of people out, but really what I think it means is that they're just less interested in religion. But that doesn't mean that they're not spiritual. There's a difference there. Let me share some other things. Non-Christian barriers to faith. This is Barna. Barna is they're like Christian sociologists. Gen Z, it's backwards, but I think you got it. These are teens responding to certain statements. I have a hard time believing that a good God would allow so much evil or suffering in the world. Millennials are at 30%, Gen Z 29%. Christians are hypocrites. Millennials 31%. Gen Z said 23%. And this might shock you, but that's less than Gen X and boomers. Gen Z are less likely to say that Christians are hypocrites than their previous generations. I believe science refutes too much of the Bible. Millennials, 20%, which is less than millennials, or sorry, Gen Z is 20%, which is less than millennials, Gen X, and boomers. Again, they don't think science is the problem. Let me see. There are too many injustices in the history of Christianity, 15%, which is less than the others, other than millennials. They don't care about injustices in the history of Christianity. They care about injustices today. Mm-hmm. I used to go to church, but it's just not that important to me. 12%, which is the highest, although it's the same as what boomers would say. So that generation is also not going to church anymore. but we don't talk about that as much as the youngins.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, let me go to the next one. Reasons that church attendance is not important. Where'd that go? These are the top 2 reasons, according to Gen Z. Church is not relevant to me personally, 59%.
Wow.
I find God elsewhere, 48%. And the rest are lower. What that tells me is that we need to do a better job at making the church relevant. How do we do that? How can we make church relevant to young people?
Let's ask them.
Yeah, that's a good thing to do.
I
Some
don't know.
churches have thought, well, let's change our building, let's change our worship, let's water things down. That's not it. That's not the answer. Other churches have said, well, let's do nothing, and they need to rise to our standards. That doesn't work either. So, Stan, you trying to say something?
Well, what did I didn't hear the word Nelda said there.
Nelda said that we should ask them to know how to be relevant.
I think it has to do with relationships too. That, of course, if you're just going to go to church, you're going to go to the teen group and then leave right after that, and nobody gets to talk to them and actually get to know who they are or anything about them, then yeah, that's all it's going to be. But if we start having the relationships like this class is trying to give us with the teens, that they're going to feel more a part. And that's, I know I've mentioned it before, but just having some type of a role in the worship, or being a greeter, or helping, teach the little kids, anything. When you're a part and you're actually doing something as part of the body, you feel much, much more involved. You feel important, and you feel like you have to be there to do it as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the idea of giving them some kind of ownership is huge. And a lot of churches, we treat them kind of like second-class citizens. We talked about this that first session. When you're older, then you can have an opinion, or we give them the little roles, or even worse, we expect them to almost perform for us, and we think that that's including them, but it's really just about boosting our own egos. Here are some positive things. These are perceptions of church among church-going teens. So these would be Gen Z who identify as Christians in some form. The church is a place to find answers to live a meaningful life. 82% agree with that statement. The church is relevant for my life. 82%. So again, teens who are already involved in church have gotten the message. Do you see the difference there? So all Gen Z, when they were polled, one of the biggest barriers was church isn't relevant. Well, we can pat ourselves on the back a little bit, because when they are involved, they see that it's relevant. At least 82% of them do. I feel like I can be myself at church, 77%. People at church are tolerant of those with different beliefs, 63%, which is, we could do better on that, I think. Okay. I think there's one other thing I wanted to look at. Oh yeah. They also did some studies, this Barna group, on just some different things about the church in comparing like churched teens and engaged teens to like adults, whether they're churched or engaged. And basically, in a nutshell, what they were finding was that engaged Christian teens were lining up with engaged Christian adults. And what that means is they didn't see any major disconnects for those teens who are deeply engaged in the life of the church and are forming a strong Christian identity. They're coming up with the same answers as Christian adults, you know. So for example, faith, so the statement, faith in Jesus is the only way to God. Across the board for Gen Z, across the board for all adults, 53%. But for engaged Christian teens and engaged Christian adults, 96% would agree with that. So what they're showing with this information, they asked all sorts of different questions. The Bible is totally accurate in all of the principles it teaches. Jesus was a real person, those kind of things. What they're seeing is there's a disconnect between unchurched and churched, but there's not a disconnect between church adults, church teens. So that's a positive thing. It means that at least right now, young people who are engaged in the life of the church feel strong, have a strong identity with those principles and those ideas. At least the core things of orthodoxy, you know, about Jesus and God, scripture, those kind of things. So we kind of need to start wrapping some stuff up here. Any other thoughts or observations? Let me wrap up with just 5 quick little markers of the faith of Gen Z. I'll just kind of bullet point these, and next week we can talk a little bit more. So when it comes to faith and Gen Z, these are just things that are characteristic of the generation. One is something we've talked about, that they are growing up in a post-Christian world. And what that means is it's not that young people are not thinking about, it's not that they're rejecting God and religion. It's just they're not thinking about it. It's not a core central piece of society anymore to go to church. So it's not that they've rejected it. It's that they don't really know. It's not a big deal. And that's true for not just teens, that's true for adults too. Experiential. Young people prefer to engage with religion in experiential ways, like mission trips, social activism, service work, as opposed to church attendance. Another way to think about that is their commitment is formed around community, not ideology. So I believe in this core doctrine, so I'm a part of this church, is not the way they think. It's this group has accepted me, they are my people, I'm a part of this church. And then one other one is just making a difference in the world. I think that is one, when we talk about solutions to these problems, I think that is a huge avenue to this younger generation, is that they want to make a difference in this world, globally, economically, individually, environmentally. They want things to change. And I mean, we can say that this world is not my home, but we're going to lose a lot of people along the way if we think that way. But if we maybe change gears and start thinking about how can we show young people that the way of Jesus commands us to actively help enrich the lives of others. That when we follow Jesus, that we will be changing the world, just like he told us to. We will be helping the poor. We will be helping the sick. We will be helping the marginalized. And I think that would be a huge avenue to reach out to more young people. And because that's what they're interested in. They are selfish brats sometimes, but they really do care more than I think a lot of us do about changing the world. Okay, I think that's good for tonight. And let's see, next week, we're gonna get practical and talk about what can we do? How can we change, be better, respond better? Hey, Joel, good night. Respond better to young people and be a good receiver and just be able to be with young people. We'll look at that next week. Cool. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, it's nice to see Allison tonight, Dan. Oh, and we got to see Kelsey after a whole year in
Hi,
in our-
Kelsey.
our tunnels there.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. Good night, everyone.